Good afternoon, everyone. It brings me immense joy to extend a warm welcome to each one of you for another enriching session of the ICS Wednesday seminar. I'm Amit Dogra, a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and I'm honored to serve as the master of ceremony for today's event. I extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you who has joined us. The title for today's seminar is Teaching Chinese to the World, the Political Economy of the Confucius Institutes. The China's Confucius Institutes play a role similar to the British Council in promoting language and culture worldwide. Since the launch of the first Confucius Institute in 2005, there are now some 450 worldwide. In addition, there are some 1,000 Confucius classrooms operating at the school level. Confucius Institutes and Confucius Classrooms differ from their comparators in having Chinese university and school partners. The Confucius Institutes also differ by being located within their host universities. They have faced challenge, especially in the US during Trump's presidency, where the majority of over 100 have been obliged to close down. In this seminar, we will explore the wider political economy of Confucius Institutes, including in India, where there is only one Confucius classroom and half a Confucius Institute. The speaker for today is Professor Kenneth King, who is Emeritus Professor at the Schools of Education and of Social and Political Studies, Edinburgh University. He was formerly the director of the Center of African Studies and professor of international and comparative education at Edinburgh University for many years. His research focuses on international education, aid policy, and skill development. His publication includes China's Aid and Soft Power in Africa and Education, Skills, and International Cooperation, published by Springer in 2020. His latest edited book with Meera Venkatachalam is titled India's Development, Diplomacy, and Soft Power in Africa. He is currently completing his work on the geopolitics of China's Confucius Institutes. Chairing today's session is Ambassador Kishan S. Rana. He joined the Indian Foreign Services in 1960 and served in the Indian Embassy in China. He was the Indian Ambassador High Commissioner to Algeria, Czechoslovakia, Kenya, Mauritius, and Germany. A polyglot, he speaks Chinese and French, besides English, Kathiawari, and Hindi. He is Professor Emeritus at Diplo Foundation, Malta and Geneva, Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Archives by Fellow, Churchill College, Cambridge, and Public Policy Scholar, Woodrow Wilson Center, Washington, D.C. He has authored and edited 14 books, with two translated into Chinese. His latest work is Churchill and India, Manipulation or Betrayal. Before I hand over to Ambassador Rana, I would request all participants to adhere to some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the presentation. You may post your question in the chat box. Alternatively, you may use the raise hand option during the interactive session. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. Please remember to mention your name and affiliation while posting your questions. I now hand over the floor to the chair to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Amit. My friends at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Professor Kenneth King, it is an honor for me to chair today's session. Professor King has chosen a subject, namely the working of China's Confucius Institutes, which is very much, in my view, an understudied subject. I will leave it to Professor King to. There is a little disturbance. Would you mute everyone if you can from the side of the management of the program? Okay. So these institutes, when they were first presented, when they first took shape, it seemed to be a very innovative idea to establish institutes within universities, within educational institutions around the world. But very soon it became clear that the innovative idea had run into a serious problem. And the problem was that the Chinese authorities managing these institutes wanted a certain degree of tight control over the work of the institutes. This flies in the face of autonomy of educational institutions, and that led to problems. A number of institutes were closed down, particularly in North America and in some West European countries. So the numbers grew, but then also they shrank. And the story of the Confucius Institutes is really quite fascinating. I'm interested in the institutes, and I'm also interested, frankly, in the wider connection between these institutes and the working of China's education diplomacy, its cultural diplomacy, and indirectly, and at a big tangent to all this, it relates also to China's diaspora diplomacy, particularly the way in which China connects with its students, Chinese students studying in foreign countries. These issues have been explored in a number of recent articles in The Economist magazine and elsewhere, and I would commend this for your attention if the subject is of interest to you. But I will not say very much more at this point. I may have some remarks to make after Professor King has spoken, but I think this is time to hand over to Professor King, and let's listen to him and view the PowerPoint presentation that is already on the screen. Over to you, Professor Kenneth King. I very much look forward to your remarks. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much, Kishan. It's a real privilege to be chaired by what you yourself call a China Walla, somebody who has been for many years in China, I think between 10 and 15 years in China, apart from being, I suppose I'm a Kenya Walla, so it's nice
also
that you too have been in Kenya as High Commissioner, as my wife's father was many years ago, 20 years before you. I'm going to kick off with, now it's meant to move forward, but it won't go.
These, yeah, not this.
Can you just come and make the screen go forward? Sorry, Kishan, there's just a mild note.
No problem, no problem.
Okay, there we are. This is only a bit of background on myself, so we don't need to pay much attention here, apart from noticing that it's a little bit of what I've done over the years. So I'll look at these different 5 areas during my talk. You'll see that I started off on Pan-Africanism and only very recently started looking at CIs, Confucius Institutes. I got to China a lot later than you, Kishan. I only got there in 2006. And very luckily, China had just published its African policy a few weeks before I arrived. So the person who invited me said, will you do your first seminar? So I thought, I'll do it on, seeing I'm an Africanist, I'll do it on China's African policy. And if you read that, it's a very interesting document to read. And I'm sure some of you in the room have read it, even though you're not Africanists. It's only 7 pages, by the way. So it's not like some dreary white papers by the British government. Some of the key words in that document are these ones: learning from each other, mutual, and win-win. You're all China experts, so you'll know that these are very common phrases, emphasizing that it's not a relationship of aid, but of mutuality. Cooperation. There was no mention in that document, although it was published a year after the first Confucius Institute, there was no mention of CIs. But as you can see, they did promise to send teachers to Africa. So that was my first seminar, and it led eventually to a book that I did, which is there in both Chinese and in English. I'm not sure if you can find that in Midland Bookshop, and whether the Chinese version is available in China, I don't know. Now, one of the things I've written a bit about in recent years is that many academics, including myself, realize that there's a role of serendipity in what we actually end up doing, or end up marrying, if you want to add something to that. I mean, I used to do Greek and Latin at university, and if only I had done Chinese, I'd be speaking to you in Chinese, and I'd have written a book that allowed me to interview people in Chinese instead of in English. So there's an example of serendipity. I did Greek and Latin. I didn't do Chinese. And then my PhD topic, one or two of you around the table here are doing PhDs. I chose my PhD topic entirely by chance. I was looking in the university library. I found a couple of books. They were about the first education commission that went to Africa. But it was a highly political commission. It was suggesting that African education should be based on what the North Americans were suggesting for Black Americans in the South. So it was a highly controversial commission. So I started off, my PhD was therefore quite controversial. It was about the role of racism, basically, in proposing what should be African education. So that was by chance. I also, when at the same time that Kishan was Indian High Commissioner in Kenya, I found by chance the informal sector in Kenya. Just by chance, I just found people who were making machines in the slums of Nairobi. And for the next 10 years, I did work on the informal sector. And by chance, I told you earlier, I came to Hong Kong University by chance. It might be interesting to hear from you whether you've chosen your PhD or your army career by chance, or because your dad was in the army, or you wanted to go to Northern. Anyway, if we have time, we'll come back to that. By the way, I started at 3:07, and Kishan is going to tell me when I've got 5 minutes to go. As Kishan was saying, these CIs are a bit like these European parallel bodies, and they're mostly responses to requests from the university. They're not imposed on Kenya or Scotland. And as Kishan was saying, unlike the British Council, unlike Goethe Institute, they're actually inside the university. That, of course, is going to prove a problem for some, but only a few. They're joint ventures. For example, we've got a fantastic CI in our university, and we're linked to a top Chinese university, which one or two of you may have visited, Fudan in Shanghai, top university. And the other thing that makes them different from the other European comparators is they have two directors. A Chinese director, we have one from Fudan, and a chap from Edinburgh. So that's quite a good parallel, a good example of innovation. And the other thing is there's no single model. We'll see that in a moment. This is an old quote from State Councillor Liu Yandong. Some of you will know her name. They're expected to have their own unique styles. They need to respect and embody cultural diversity. There are model CIs, but there is no single model for CIs, The person who was really very important for the development of CIs was the Hanban director, Shu Lin. She was a star in many ways, but controversial. She said, look, there's no ideological element in the CI, it's cultural. So you can't call the CIs a Mao Zedong Institute, a Mao Institute. It's got nothing to do with politics. Well, we're going to see that it has got to do with politics, but only because of politicians deciding that it has to do with politics. And she said to a visiting US diplomat, 70 CIs can't beat the influence of one mega Hollywood film screened in China. So don't let's get CIs out of out of proportion. This is a well-known Chinese scholar in the CASS, He Wenping. Some of you will have known of her, I'm sure. She said, China's got a really impressive hard power in Africa, but its soft power has been relatively weak until recently. But suddenly the CIs suggested putting soft power at the heart of China's promotion overseas. And I would say that the CIs are probably the largest language project the world has ever seen. In the short time between 2005 and 2024, that's what we call 20 years, thousands of institutes teaching Chinese around the world. Confucius Classrooms in schools and Confucius Institutes in universities. I should boast to say that our university, CI, is a very impressive, oh, thanks so much, a very impressive historic building. We didn't give the CI some little room on the side. We gave the CI one of the top historical buildings in the university, Abden House. And it does all those things. It's called the CI for Scotland. So we were trying to boast that of course, since our CI, many other CIs were started in Scotland. Now, here's a question you might want to think about. And again, Kishan mentioned this in his introduction. What is going to be more influential in the University of Edinburgh? We won't believe the figure. We have 8,000 Chinese students at the moment. We have one CI. And the CI is not teaching Chinese in the regular curriculum of China studies. So you want to try and balance, what is the impact of 8,000 Chinese students in our university? If you want to see what the CI did in its first 15 years, if you go onto the website on the bottom of that slide there, you'll see a fantastically rich range of things that the CI has done, including critical history of the Cultural Revolution, critical history of what China was doing pre-Mao, post-Mao. So it's not a kind of ideological trap that the CI, there've been lots of very... So I think that reinforces the theme that CIs are a bit like thousand flowers. For those of you who are interested in Africa and who've been there, there's 63 in Africa. Not one in each country, because only 54 countries. There's 6 in South Africa, 4 in Kenya, etc., etc. 1 or 2 countries don't have a CI. And in my old university, I used to teach in Nairobi University when we got married, and it has a very impressive CI there. And if you look at the numbers, there's more CIs in Africa now than there are German or British Council or other comparative cultural institutes. That's an impressive rate of growth. Now, some of you will know that in old universities like JNU, where Alka is, Chinese has been taught, and in Edinburgh, Chinese has been taught for years. Long before the CIs were introduced in 2005, we were teaching Chinese in Edinburgh and in Cambridge and in elsewhere, and in London, SOAS. That was not the case in Africa. So the CIs have been responsible, and say in my old university in Nairobi, the CIs are responsible for you can now do a BA in Chinese in Nairobi. And there's many other universities. That might be quite a good thing. Think about it. Now, I think there's a contrast between Europe and Africa. In Europe, many of the CIs are promoting business links with China. But in Africa, the CIs are promoting access to Chinese businesses in Africa. So kids are going to learn Chinese in Nairobi because there's so many Chinese firms. Same in Ethiopia, same in Rwanda, same in Ghana, same in South Africa. Different situation. So I'll give you some examples of these specialisms. You've got agricultural CIs, as you can see in this slide. Kenya's got an agricultural CI. And you can find them in 2 or 3 other countries, Thailand and Pakistan being 2 of those. And of course, as you know, in China, agricultural universities are very strong. So it's a natural specialization. There's a textile CI in Kenya, in Moi University, which we visited, of course. And if you want to go to Oxford Brookes, I know you guys aren't Africanists, right? No Africanists in the room except for me and Pravina. If you want to go to Oxford Brookes, the African Studies Association of the UK is having a conference in August, and there's a publishing CI in Oxford Brookes linked to Beijing Foreign Studies University, and so on. Now, one of the most popular CI's specialisms is, as you might imagine, is this: Chinese traditional medicine. There's at least 14 CIs around the world which say that they are CIs on traditional medicine. Very attractive in America and UK and elsewhere. In fact, they formed an alliance, as you can see there, with CIs from Brazil to Australia and from Cuba to Japan. Even in South Africa, the Traditional Healers Organization is linked into the CI in Western Cape, which is a very well-known university. Some of you know Goldsmiths. They have a CI that focuses on dance and music. And in Denmark, there's a music CI. Huh? What about that? And, you know, it's not linked to a university in China. Obviously, it's linked to the Chinese Conservatory of Music. So, you know, the other one is linked to the Beijing Dance Academy. Then business, of course, there's quite a lot of business CIs, such as Heriot Watt, CI for business in London, LSE, and the top university in China, Tsinghua. And there are others where there's a whole lot of business courses, even in our own CI. It's not called a business CI in Edinburgh, but there's lots of courses on business. Business Chinese. You can do a course on that. There's science and technology. And by the way, those of you who know the Open University, just started last year, 2 years ago. There's an online CI at the OU. So there's a whole series, therefore, of specialist CIs. 1 or 2 of the CIs have closed. There used to be a CI on opera and martial arts. Used to be a CI, but these have closed. So there are about 50 CIs which have got the formal status of being called model CIs. One example of that would be Edinburgh, is regarded as a model CI, and so would Nairobi University. There are several others. And there are obviously regular CIs. Now, it would be quite interesting to know more about why are there so few CIs in India? Why are there so many? Why is there only one? Well, you might argue there's two, but in fact, Mumbai University is scheduled to close its CI last year. And if you look at the website, it's out of date. The website of Mumbai University, Vellore University of Technology still claims to be open. And in Calcutta, there is a Confucius Classroom in a private school of world languages. So in this enormous country, huh? Is there? What is there? I don't think I've not, nowhere can you find evidence of a CI or a CC in Pondicherry. The only places, there used to be one in JNU for a few months, but that stopped. There's a whole history of that. But it would be quite an interesting topic for a PhD or a master's student. Why are there so few CIs and CCs in this enormous country with its massive education, higher education and education system? Okay, so some other research questions. As I say here's the one, CIs in India. Have a look at that. I think the reason for there only being half a CI in Mumbai is the Indian government refused to give a visa for the Chinese director. That's the case, okay? The first director was allowed to come. The current CI does not have a Chinese director, and that's very unusual. All the other CIs have got Chinese directors and Scottish directors. By the way, there's 5 CIs in Pakistan. What about looking at this? Look at the number of Indian students in China compared to the number of Chinese students in India. Now, somebody has said that this is the ice age of India-China relations. I don't know who said that, but there's a huge number of Indian students who go to China, particularly for medicine. And there's a very small number of Chinese students in India. There are more Indian students going to China than there are Indian students going to UK. Okay? As of 2 years ago. I don't know, the numbers may have changed. Those of you who are interested in Japan like you are, with your tie, here's a key question for you. It's quite a key question. Find out and let me know if you get the answer. There's a dozen CIs in Japan, but not a single one is in a public university, in a national university. They're all in private universities. What's the reason? It looks like there's been a government directive. I'm not sure, but a research question. The top university and private university, Waseda, has got a CI, and it's got very close links with the Communist Party of China, but not a single CI in a public university. What about CIs in the Middle East? You know, there's a war going on there at the moment. There's 2 CIs in Israel. What about Gaza? What are the CIs doing about the Middle East? Interesting area, Ukraine, you have a look at that as well. There are CIs in Ukraine. Now, what about the international relations side? I've got about, I think, 10 minutes to go, but my chair will intervene if I'm going on too long. Here's a question that occurred to me when I was doing this PowerPoint. Does the huge network of 1,000 CCs, Confucius Classrooms in schools, and the 500 or 400 plus CIs, does it operate as a kind of Chinese Peace Corps? Because it's bringing hundreds of young Chinese to different countries. Thousands are being exposed to places like Mexico, Costa Rica, Chile, South Africa. And unlike the Peace Corps, they're going north as well as south. They're going to Edinburgh, not just to so-called developing countries. So, interesting question. Another question would be, what might be the relationship between the thousands of Chinese international students most of which, by the way, are not in developing countries. They're in places like Edinburgh. They're not in Swaziland. Chinese students are not going to Swaziland. They're going to Boston. They're going to the top universities in South Africa. They're not going to Botswana. What's the relationship between these hundreds of thousands of Chinese and the small number of CIs? I don't think there is much of a relationship myself in Edinburgh, but we have no research on that. Nobody has done research on that question. Now, in these first 19 slides, and I've got about 6 minutes to go, we've dealt with the vision, the ambition. I'm now going to switch to the bias, disinformation, and fake news that surrounds the dimensions of the CI, and especially in some parts of Europe, a few countries only, and in Trump's America. You can't find these controversies in the Middle East, in East Asia, in Latin America, or in Africa. So there's another question. Why is it that the controversies are only in the so-called democracies? If you want to have an interesting read, it's quite, my screen has stopped. Can we get back to the, you can just put it back to the screen. If you look at the, there we are, coming up. Yeah, if you look at Wikipedia, there's an article called Criticism of Confucius Institutes. It's quite extraordinary. There's no article in Wikipedia saying criticism of British Council or criticism of Goethe Institutes. This article is about 85,000 words long, and it tabulates all the problems about CIs being spy centers and a lot of other stuff. Why is that? You should ask the director of Wikipedia. He's a nice guy. So disinformation is part of what is happening with the CIs, and we'll come back to discuss to what extent this is justified. Those of you who've been following fake news and misinformation will know that, you know, we suffered from misinformation in Britain because Cambridge Analytica, the Cambridge firm that intervened in the elections in Kenya and intervened in the elections for Brexit, the referendum. Cambridge Analytica was responsible for us leaving the EU. But the Conservative government paid no attention to the fact that was. Anyway, we would still be in the EU today if there hadn't been disinformation promoted by Wikipedia, not by Wikipedia, but by Cambridge Analytica. They've been stopped. They're out now out of business. It's too late. We're out of Europe. We're poorer. And so just in finishing, yeah, I've got 2 more slides. What closed down the CIs in the USA during Trump's time? They were given a choice between getting Chinese funds or getting funds from the federal government. And most large universities get an enormous amount of money from federal funds. So it's a no-brainer to say choose between what China's giving for a CI in your university and what you're getting from the Defense Department, from many of the other departments. So many simply closed their CIs because they had a pistol put to their head. It wasn't a pistol in Trump's hands, but some of Trump's closest aides made the decision. I'll give you the names if you want to know. So 3 years after, there's the thing, the bill will cut federal funds to universities and colleges that have Confucius Institutes and that don't comply with the new rules. So federal funds are critical to universities in the US, much more so than in the UK. We had the same problem in UK. Our prime minister, current prime minister, said he was going to close the CIs when he was competing to become the leader of the Conservative Party. He promised to close. Liz Truss, who used to be in favor of CIs, changed and said she would like to close the CIs. So you can see there's lots of, so as I say at the bottom line here, ask yourself the question, what lies behind the attack in US and UK on the CIs? Is it something about what the CIs are doing, or is it something to do with the politics, the anti-China politics of particular people like Trump, like Liz Truss, Nancy Pelosi, who in their right minds would go to Taiwan? And, so all I'm suggesting you might want to do is have a close look critically at the text about what's meant to be happening in CIs. The Government Accountability Office, by the way, in the USA, had a year-long analysis of the CIs, and they reached the judgment that they were unable to find any evidence of widespread interference with academic freedom. The Government Accountability Office. So maybe the real issue, as I say at the bottom there, is not the CI at all. It's the anti-China feelings stirred up by people like Trump and his parallels. So I think we can, that's my last slide there. We should just remember some parts of this anti-China war, if you like. We should remember the China virus stuff of Trump. We should remember the China war of Trump. And unfortunately, Joe Biden has continued with some of the sort of anti-China feeling. But I think it's worth asking ourselves, what can we as critical students and teachers, how should we react to this situation? Where, as you can see from my talk, we've got some amazing CIs around the world, including in the universities where I have taught in Nairobi and Edinburgh. And those are not in any way interfering with academic freedom. They're creating a discussion. So if you want to look at some of the papers that have been written by my colleague Li Su Yuan, and you could also look at some of the stuff that at the bottom there, Ambassador Kishan Rana, who is a Chinawala, has written, including about China. And you should try and check out that Wikipedia article. But if you want to write to me about any of this, that's my email. And that's the email of Li Si Yuan, if you want to get those papers that are referred to. I think it's time that I stopped, Kishan. So
thank you.
There we are.
Thank you very much, Professor Kenneth King, for a very wide-angle and detailed review of China's Confucius Institutes. We have so far 3 questions in the chat window, and I would encourage more people to please come up with their questions, because Professor King has really given a very thought-provoking presentation where he has brought up ideas and angles which are not frequently debated when we talk of the Confucius Institutes. Why were so many Confucius Institutes closed down in the United States? Kenneth, I think the closures started much before the arrival of Trump as president. And I am not entirely sure if the management of the Confucius Institutes has been as open or democratic as you have suggested in your presentation, or whether there was, in fact, or there has been resistance from these institutes to not permit discussions of a political kind which would question some of China's policies. My impression is that one reason why years back, long before the arrival of Trump as president, there were questions raised about the operation of these institutes. I don't think you've touched on this, and this is, I think, an important point. I'm also not sure if the Confucius Institutes are as benign and open-minded as you have suggested. But this is not a subject that I have explored in detail, and I respect your judgment on this. If you feel that they have really added great value to the universities and institutions where they are embedded, that's interesting. And I'm also intrigued by the fact that no other country has attempted that formula, which is to install their cultural institutes within foreign universities and institutes. It is certainly a very interesting model. You mentioned the number of Chinese students in Africa. And you said there are, was it 8,000 was mentioned as a figure, perhaps? Chinese
in Edinburgh University.
8,000, yes. Oh, I have no doubt that there are huge numbers of Chinese universities in Western institutions. But I did not have the impression that there are huge number of Chinese students in African universities.
Yeah.
I have not seen any figures on this, and I would welcome further information if you or anyone else has hard data on this. At the end of the day, are the Confucius Institutes simply offering an insight into Chinese cultural practices, China's experience, be it in medicine, be it in other areas? Or is it that they are used to present a certain political narrative about China and not permit discussion of issues which would be critical of China? After all, academic freedom is important in every educational institution. And my impression is that countries have resisted the opening of Confucius Institutes, be it Japan's public universities or India or other countries. I think this has something to do with it. That in fact, to allow a foreign partner country, which is essentially a state-run global enterprise, which is what China is really. You mentioned that you have had discussions at Edinburgh University on the Cultural Revolution and on various historical events. I'm intrigued by this. Were these really very open discussions? Were they really open to the point where people could speak of the excesses and the huge amount of damage and death that the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution had brought? Was this really debated in those institutions? I'd be interested in that. But I don't want to monopolize the discussion. I would invite anyone who wants to use the raised hand, and I don't think we have anyone who has so far used that option. But I see a number of comments that have now come in the chat window. So Amit, would you be kind enough to go through the questions that have been posed and focus, please, on questions which really relate to the presentation that Professor King has made? I know there are some questions about Buddhism and how Buddhism is practiced in China. I don't think this is a subject on which Professor King has spoken at all, and it wouldn't be fair to load these kind of questions onto him, especially when there are others waiting with sharp questions that relate directly to the presentation that the professor has made. So Amit, the floor is yours. Please bunch up questions, one or two together if you can, and please go forward. Thank you.
So before that, we have a raised hand option.
No, raise hand option does not have priority over the chat window questions. I would rather give priority to the chat window, and the raised hand, of course, will come up anyway on my own screen. Thank you very much.
So this is a question from Mr. Rajkumar. How do you view current state of India's soft power after African Union becoming G21 in comparison?
Again, Amit, sorry to interrupt. India's soft power is not something that Professor King has addressed. So let's stick to first, at least, to questions that directly relate to what Professor King has spoken about. And then if we have time, we can go to those other wider questions. Thank you very much.
We have a question from Ms. Ritu Agrawal. How did these Confucius Institutes co-opt with the national image and local interest in different countries?
Can you repeat that, Amit?
Yes, sir. How did these CIs co-opt the national image and local interests in different countries?
Co-opt the national image.
No, the nationals, how did they attract participants into the program from the countries where they are located?
Oh, shall I answer that right away?
Please, please.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, when we were discussing the CIs in Africa, I compared the attraction I mentioned two attractions. One, that the CIs make it possible in a whole number of countries in Africa. Remember, there's 63 CIs in Africa. They made it possible for people, students who aspire to work in China or in Chinese firms in Africa, to get a really good grounding in Chinese, get a BA in Chinese. So that's one attraction of why people get interested in going to the CI. And that includes people, and most of the CIs, you can either be a student as a registered student of the CI, or you can come in from outside and pay a small fee and get access to the classes. But the second reason that people do it, and it's connected to the first, is that there are many students or people who are interested can see that there are large numbers of Chinese firms in countries around the world, particularly in Africa, where the Chinese are very much present. And so there's an interest in, to get a job there, you have a better chance if you can speak Chinese. And that's the same in a different way in the UK. People are aware that if you want to do business in China, why don't you get some business Chinese? And we can offer that in Edinburgh University. That's a quick answer.
Can I just add to it?
Listen, Pravina.
We're talking around the table. The other reason, I think, is that China offers many pathways to students from different African countries to be based at universities in China, sometimes with English medium courses. So it's a way of students getting scholarships and access to areas that they are particularly interested in.
There are actually several thousand CI scholarships. Pravina has just reminded me that not just regular Chinese Scholarship Council scholarships, but there are specifically CI scholarships will take you to the top universities in China, where you can do English, teaching Chinese as a foreign language. And you can then come back and teach Chinese in the CI. So the equivalent of teaching English as a foreign language, there's huge numbers of courses teaching Chinese as a foreign language. Thanks.
And Professor King, next question is from Venkataraman KK. He is asking, one of the criticisms about CI is their lack of transparency in the MOUs and their functioning. Could you please comment on the same?
I haven't looked at MOUs is a funny term. I know lots and lots of countries which have a whole number of Godrej cabinets filled with MOUs, all of which are dead, you know, I mean, the dead MOUs are all over the world. I've never looked at the MOU for the University of Edinburgh CI, but the terms of the MOU are to be found on the website of the Confucius Institute in China. You can see exactly what is the agreement between Edinburgh University and China, and linking that to Fudan. What is the role of Fudan and Edinburgh, China?
So next question.
Could I just answer one very relevant point that Kishan himself raised, which was that were there some criticisms of the CI in countries like the USA before the Trump era? And the answer is that there were. Notably, there was a very well-known anthropologist whose name escapes me at the moment, but Flavina is going to dig it out, in the University of Chicago, who waged a sort of 3-year-long personal campaign to try and close down the CI in Chicago. He eventually managed to do it, and he wrote an amazingly boring book about what a malign influence the CIs were. So he's respected for his work on anthropology, but in the view of many, he's not respected for his deliberate attempt as a scholar to undermine the CI in Chicago. There are other examples, as you know, Kishan, but including in Canada, including in France, but there certainly have been ones before the Trump onslaught.
Okay.
So there was another question. I
Carry
think
on.
Yes,
Amit?
sir.
there was a question from Jayashree, I think.
We'll come to the Jayashree in a moment. I know Jayashree has a raised hand, but Amit, we'll take one question from you from the chat window, and then we'll shift to Jayashree.
All right, Mr. So Farah Khan wants to know, around the Confucius Institute, how do these institutes navigate the delicate balance between cultural exchange and political influence, especially in regions like Africa, where China's presence is growing rapidly? Also, how do these specialized institutes contribute to cross-cultural understanding and collaboration in those respective fields?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think the political influence thing, which you referred to, has been, I think, greatly exaggerated. I mean, the people say that you can't talk about the 3 T's in a Confucius Institute. You know what the 3 T's are? It's Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen. But now Xinjiang. But that isn't true of my experience. Obviously, if you come into Edinburgh University and say, I want to, I'm in my lecture on Christianity, I want to say the following stuff about Jesus. I mean, you won't get very far. So it's a tricky area to distinguish between the interference in political. I haven't seen that in the majority of. I've visited many CIs in Africa, all of the ones in Kenya, most of them in South Africa. I don't see the people who are running these things are it's not just a Chinese walla running them, somebody from Fudan University. They're being run by a distinguished professor in University of Cape Town. So, I mean, people like those guys, and the same, the professor who ran the Chinese CI in Edinburgh was a very distinguished professor of Chinese. She is not about to have political propaganda from the Mao era being handed out to students. You wouldn't stand a chance in Edinburgh of doing that. And I think the same is true of Nairobi. You won't get away with doing that. So I think it's a good question, but I think it's one thing you should perhaps try and research yourself. Get hold of, you'll find it hard to do research in India, only one, and it's just about to close. But if you're quick, you get down there and have a word with the director, who is, by the way, a German scholar. She doesn't even speak Chinese, but you could have a word with her. Or talk to Alka Acharya. She knows quite a lot about this.
Okay. Amit, let's now move to the question put by the raised hand from Jayashree Barua. Jayashree, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was quite interesting and covered, especially in terms of how CIs are.
Can you speak a little louder? It's not very clear.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah.
Jayashree?
Come up here, Jason. Bring the chair over here.
Sit down here. Oh,
Bring it a bit nearer. Huh?
come and speak in. Mike.
Once again, thank you so much for the presentation. It was quite interesting.
No, only quite. Oh, God.
Also, a really pleasure to hear from you, from your experience. And this was quite interesting to me how you have been quite. Sorry. So I was also not aware of Confucius Institutes and their categories like agriculture, textile even, then music, dance,
Yeah.
TCM, publication also. So that brought few questions as well later. But first is publication wise, like what do you mean by a publication Confucian Institutes? Like, do they publish? What do they publish?
I think it's, I mean, that publication CI, they're looking at the whole process of editing and publishing. So the CI is linked to publishing concerns in the UK and publishing concerns in China. And the students are getting access to, in Chinese, to understanding how publishing works in China and in UK. So it's expertise on publishing, like expertise on agriculture.
It's kind of teaching how to publish, and
Some of the issues concerned with publishing, yeah.
that's interesting. And then third question also, it's a little bit technical. So same like the CIA, like you mentioned, like Beijing Foreign Affairs University. So do they always like partner with a Chinese institution, you know, when they go abroad, like go to foreign countries? For example, like Edinburgh University, would they always have like a partner institutions in China?
Yeah, I mean, all the CIs have links with universities in the UK, apart from one or two, which have links with a particular federal institution at the provincial level, or and for example, with the Confucius Classrooms, again, almost all the classrooms have links with Chinese schools through. So it's very attractive because it means that instead of just having a pen friend, you get a chance through the bank of mum and dad to go to the schools where you have this link. Again, with the exception of Tianjin, where the municipal authority is responsible for sending teachers to Strathclyde CCs in Scotland.
Right.
So it's a municipality rather than a school.
So they also probably would have like programs where like homeschooling, they're going to China and staying in home, because
Oh,
I
yeah.
stayed in Shanghai for 4 years. So
4 years. That's
they
long.
have sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was my that's
All right.
Okay. Can we shift back to the questions posed through the virtual medium, so to speak? Ravi Bhutalingam has a raised hand. We will take Ravi's question and then Amit, please be ready to present questions posed through the chat window or even the YouTube channel if you can. Yes, Ravi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor King, for a very, very stimulating presentation. You have pointed out how the effect on Confucius Institutes in the US and in some countries in Europe has been linked with what one might call the Trump discourse on China. Now, my question relates to the probably considerably higher and a larger number of Confucius Institutes in other parts of the world, namely East Asia, that is Japan and Korea, in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. What was the impact there? Did anything similar happen? If not, why not? And the second part of the question is, I was very intrigued, and I thought it was quite creative to link some of the Confucius Institutes to particular trades, like you mentioned, textile engineering and so on. Has that trend increased, decreased, or remains constant? But it strikes me that it might be quite attractive in many parts of the developing world. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi, for a very interesting question. As I think I referred to in my talk, the kind of problem that the CIs ran into, especially during the Trump era, has not been found in the majority of what you could call developing countries, or even middle-income countries in the Middle East and emerging economies, if you want to use that awkward term, in Southeast Asia and East Asia. I haven't heard of, and we can ask Alka and others in the room if they have, I haven't come across any problems of this kind in Latin America, in the 63 CIs in Africa. I haven't heard about this in Singapore or Taiwan. They don't have them in Taiwan, I think, or even in Israel. So, and I haven't come across any problem of this kind, even in Moscow, where there are a number of CIs. So the CIs that have closed down in parts of Europe, and there have been some that have closed in Europe, are the result of a particular incident where China has, for example, prevented a Chinese academic who has commented critically on China or whatever it is, and has been linked, where there's been a kind of what you might call a China academic issue linked to a particular person, and the CI has been closed because of that, rather than because of the curriculum that the CI was responsible for. It's been closed because Sweden in particular had an issue with how China treated a Chinese student who had become a Swedish citizen. It's that kind of thing. We haven't had that in the UK. We've had, as I mentioned earlier, we've had one or two people who have, contestants for the Conservative Party who've threatened CIs, but I think they've been afraid to carry that into, because they would get a big backlash from the British universities, I think. What was the other part of your question, Ravi?
The second part was on linking, some of the CIs were linked to craft colleges like textile engineering, traditional medicine, and so on and so forth. And I thought I found that quite a creative venture, and asked whether these type of CIs were increasing, decreasing, or more or less the same in terms of their coverage.
I'm not sure I know the answer to that, Ravi. There certainly is, as I showed, a wide range of specialisms exemplified in the CIs. I don't know whether the number of traditional medicine CIs has increased since I did this presentation a few months ago and prepared it. But I think we could probably say that the specialist CIs are a minority of the CIs. I mean, there's about 410 CIs. There's probably 50 or so specialist CIs. So, but even the regular CIs are often quite different in their approach. Some are preparing kids in Africa for a BA, in university. Others are doing effectively extramural. The people who are coming to the University CI in Edinburgh, it's not part of their Chinese formal course. They're coming to do additional Chinese in the Confucius Institute. And they're hoping perhaps to get a chance to, as Pravina said, to go to China on a CI scholarship. Oh, they're hoping to do well in the HSK exam and you get a chance to go further.
Good. Thank you very much, Professor King. May I put to you a question that has come in the chat window directly to me? Perhaps the person asking the question wants to remain anonymous, but the question is, how come the professor rules out that CIs could not be dual use? I suppose by dual use, the implication might be, I interpret this question to mean perhaps that there may be some other specific Chinese objective behind the CIs. Can I tag on to that a question from myself? And my question to you, Professor King, is that, of course, it is understood that the CIs are used as a means of mobilizing mobilizing foreign students in the targeted countries to come to China. And that has been remarkably successful because general scholarships, etc., are being offered. The reality is that China suffers from a huge disadvantage in its global connections. And the disadvantage is that China has a language which is extremely hard to master. And without knowing the language, there is a great deal of communication that does not take place because China uses ideograms, has no phonetic symbols, unlike Japan, Korea, Vietnam, which has completely shifted to a phonetic symbol system. So is it that the Chinese also have some other objectives behind these Confucius centers? Have you considered this at all?
I think your points about language are well taken. I mean, I did say earlier that I did foolishly study Greek and Latin instead of Chinese at Cambridge University. If I'd studied Chinese, I'd be way ahead of the game now, like Philip Snow, who you probably know, who's still in Hong Kong, by the way. He did that famous book called The Star Raft, brilliant piece of research. Yeah, of course, the simplified Chinese that Mao introduced means that of the people like myself who can read pinyin, we can follow some of what is being said. And of course, you will know that Taiwan still retains the original Chinese, and that must be quite a challenge for students going to study Chinese in Taiwan. I don't think Nancy Pelosi is going to study Chinese in Taiwan, but the other part of your question, I'm trying to think through it. Pravina, do you have a reaction to that?
All that I was going to say was that I think that the Chinese, to people who I have talked to, they feel that a diversity of languages, a diversity of interactions makes for a richer dialogue. Now that's the benign, if you want to look at it. You could look at it, it depends on how we focus our lenses. If you want to look at it as, oh, China is trying to dominate the world, I think that's never going to happen. English has certainly not dominated the world. Languages all over the world flourish, and having additional languages gives you enormous advantage. So I would like to see it as a positive, which we can build and grow from and learn, rather than as something that we will be over.
Thank you.
I think
Thank you very much. We will now give the floor to Alka Acharya, the honorary director of the institute. Alka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kishan. Okay, yeah. So I hope I'm not sort of breaking the queue, but I just like to have, I have one comment and one question. It seems to me that the manner in which your argument has unfolded and the kind of data you provided about how this opposition to the Confucius Institutes starts with the politics, as it were. But the impact is always now coming down in terms of one part of the world which is actually taking this position against Confucius Institutes, which means that I looked at that Wikipedia article some time back, and hazy. I was trying to look at it again, but then you were talking. But clearly, the only institutes that have shut down have been in Western Europe and the United States. So US followed by, I think, Canada, and then Germany and UK and France, and then Belgium and so on. So that's one thing, which means that there is a certain politics that is motivating this position on. Now, the fact that cultural institutions cannot but be political is understood. I mean, there's no way you can think in terms of having no political agenda, because along with language, you are getting a whole package. And clearly, this would be used. Now, the question really is, how do we assess that political influence or that political leverage that comes along with something like the, does it really give the Chinese an advantage? Does it help them spy on the country? Does it help them to, which happened a few weeks back, does it help them to manipulate public opinion in their favor and therefore, goes against that? So that's the larger question which has come, and that's what's I think the concerns in India. But certainly I linked this up with my comment, which I found rather interesting when you said that, can we look at these Confucius Institutes as a Peace Corps? And it occurs to me that if Western Europe is going to shut down and your Americans are going to shut down, we will have larger groups and individuals marching into the rest of the world. Would you see the Chinese influence in the so-called global South that today we are witnessing? Part of the fact that, emerging partly from the fact that, well, they have a larger cultural presence, and these language and the CIs and the CCs are promoting both business and culture. And therefore, the countries of the global South are, looking so positively at this. So it employs both employment and enables them to, so that's
I think what Alka says about cultural and language institutes being essentially and unavoidably political is correct. I mean, if you recall the history of the British Council in Iran during the time before the revolution, they were incredibly popular. But when Iran began to change, the British and Americans sought to undermine militarily. You will know this. They undermined the new government in. They organized a coup against the government. The British Council, which had been amazingly popular during the Shah's time, was shut out of the country completely, and remains shut out today because the British government was involved in a coup against the revolution after the Shah. The same thing is true in France, where the Alliance Française was closed down by the Germans because they could see that the Alliance Française would be a challenge to. So you're right, and there are still, even today, there's no Alliance Française in Germany. No? So the history of the politicization of culture, which is what Alka has been referring to, is great. On the spy issue, let's be honest, all nations who have the capacity to spy, spy. All nations. This is not an American disease. This is not a Chinese disease. It is particularly, I speak of someone who is horrified at what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. It's particularly an Israeli disease. Israel is making spy cameras for the world. They are to be seen all over the place. And so spying is not by any means a Chinese disease. The Americans were spying on Angela Merkel's phone. Remember that? And on they wouldn't have learned anything by looking at David Cameron's phone, but they also did David Cameron's phone. So, but on the Peace Corps thing, I think it's quite an interesting idea. The idea that all these thousands of young Chinese are going around the world to countries they would never have gone to. I mean, who would go normally to, Costa Rica or Chad but, don't forget the Chinese are unlike the British and French. They've got embassies in all the African countries, apart from the one country that is still linked to Taiwan, Swaziland. Not exactly a top country, huh? But I would say one thing as we're coming probably towards closure. I think the massive delight of where China was going of about 10 years ago when David Cameron and George Osborne went to China in 2013, just before Xi Jinping, no, at the same time. And they were saying, in the great hold of the people, they were saying, this is the beginning of the great UK, China decade, blah, blah, blah. But politicians changed their mind. And I think that Xi has got a more aggressive approach towards China becoming, what is it you guys call it, Viksit Bharat? Well, Viksit, okay, you got that stuff? They've got the same thing in China. They're going to be 2 years later. She made it more difficult for China to become the top country in the world because people have become more hesitant about his aggressive approach to, I mean, all this blah, blah about Taiwan. I don't think he's going to do that, but I mean, get real. I mean, Taiwan invests in China to an enormous extent. And Xi Jinping must know that. So I think that, I think those are very important questions you raise. And I think, sorry.
So yes, if there is time.
Okay, I think we are a little bit beyond the time when we should have closed down our webinar. There is a question from Nirmal Panda, which obviously has not caught anyone's eye as yet. My apologies for that. He asks if the Confucius Institutes are alleged to be spying around the world in the name of teaching Chinese language. I think, in a way, Professor King has anticipated this question, and he has given a response to the question even before it was posed. May I go on to the winding up of today's session? I want to thank Professor King enormously for the insights he has brought to the discussion. Clearly, China has used the Confucius Institutes to spread its influence, to widen and deepen knowledge about China, and to mobilize foreign students into learning the Chinese language, which incidentally, Professor King, remains as complicated and difficult as it has always been, in spite of the small simplification of characters, which has not actually materially made the learning of Chinese any easier. for the simple reason that China has refused to go into any kind of phonetic symbols for the language. So Chinese remains a complex language hidden behind its ideograms, a little bit simpler today than they used to be, but it doesn't really make much of a material difference as far as learning the language is concerned. So the institutes do present an interesting model, and particularly in terms of what Professor King has told us about, which I didn't know, honestly, that some of the institutes are used to spread awareness and deepen knowledge of China's traditional medicine, of specific industrial skills, be it the textiles industry or something else. This seems to be a very interesting method. I'm intrigued by one question. If the emplacement, if the location of a foreign cultural institute in a university is as simple and benign a process as Professor King has suggested, if that is the case, then why is it that no other country has attempted to replicate that model? I think there is an element of manipulation involved in this. And of course, China has invested huge funds in its Confucius Institutes. No other country is willing to spend that kind of money. That is my impression. But this remains a question that is worth deeper exploration, and we should be very grateful to Professor Kenneth King for having made us aware of the importance of discussing this kind of a specific, focused topic, which might deepen our understanding of China's international policy. Thank you very much, Professor King. My deep thanks to everybody else who has raised questions, has participated in the discussion. And I will now leave it to Amit to formally wind up today's session. The floor is yours, Amit.
Thank you, sir. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. With this, we conclude the session and express our gratitude to Professor King and Ambassador Rana for taking time out of their busy schedule and sharing their time with us. Today's discussion video will be available on ICS YouTube platform. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming special lecture titled Building China's Landlord State, Laying the Foundation for China's Real Estate Boom. Details about the event can be found on the ICS website, or you can also subscribe to our newsletter for timely update. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.